Hello, I'm Karen Provenza with Napa Bookmine, and I'm pleased to be here tonight with Napa author Paul Wagner to talk about his debut novel, Danger, Falling Rocks. Just a little bit about the book. When a financial tycoon insists that his family join him on their annual backpacking trip into the Sierra, some of his children are not enthusiastic about this idea. And that's before people start turning up dead. Ranger Dan Courtwright is first on the scene, and he, with his friend Sheriff Cal Healy, sticks with it to the terrifying finish, which is a real cliffhanger, literally. And our author, Paul, from Napa, spent the first summers of his life in the Sierra, where his father was a ranger. Since then, he has hiked thousands of miles in the mountains, and his website, backpackthesierra.com, has become a reference for outdoor enthusiasts. While he has won international awards for his nonfiction book, this is the first of his Dan Courtwright mysteries. Thank you for being here tonight, and thank all of you for joining us. And with that, tell us a little bit more about Danger, Falling Rocks.
Well, I sort of like the story in the way it begins, because Dan is wandering about. He stumbles upon this situation. But it's a wealthy man who, in his rather misguided attempts to build a sort of family team building in one of these big adventures, ends up creating a scenario which drives them all completely crazy. And then that's, as the blurb on the book says, and that's even before people start turning up dead. And so then he is on the spot, and of course, his friend Cal Healy, the sheriff, shows up to help him solve the mystery. And the two of them work together on it. There are 7 children in the family. And if you know your medieval religious philosophy, those 7 children each stand for something in the book. Those of you who've read it you can try to figure out what that means. Mike, the tycoon wasn't based on anyone necessarily in the Napa Valley, but you and I have both been in the wine industry long enough to know that there are enough wealthy people in the wine industry. Somebody has probably done this. Yeah.
And I was reminded of Succession. I don't know how many people on the call are watching the HBO show Succession, but you have another dysfunctional family with a patriarch calling all of the shots and driving the children crazy.
It's what men do best.
Yes. How about a little bit? Why don't you pick up the book and read us?
Okay, I'll just read the opening of the book.
That'd be great.
It accomplishes at least one thing that I like, so we can talk about that. Dan heard the bear before he saw it. A rough, scratching, tearing noise that he mistook just for an instant for static on his radio. But it wasn't static. It was lower and rougher. It was a bear. And his radio wasn't on. He remembered that now and reached down very slowly to turn it back on. Maybe he was close enough to get some reception. There was no mistaking the noise now as the huge claws dug deeply into the tree bark. And then the noise changed from something even deeper as a layer of bark peeled off the tree with a hollow croaking sound. It was coming from somewhere behind him on his left. He slowly turned his head and saw the bear, some 75 feet away, standing upright and tearing at a dead tree. A good-sized black bear, maybe 250 pounds. The bear was focused on the potential food in the tree and didn't see Dan. Dan was captivated by the intimacy of the moment. The forest was still with bright sunlight streaming through the trees. A few flies buzzed in the air. Dan found himself carefully breathing through his open mouth as he watched. The bear pursued its lunch, clawing at the bark of the tree, stopping to look for grubs and bugs, tasting with its tongue. Dan could see the delicate tongue reaching out, curling into the tree bark, then slipping quickly back inside the mouth. And out again. A huge paw delicately flicked at something in the bark, and the tongue slipped out again. And then Dan's radio did crackle. A call for assistance by Sonora Pass. A bad accident. Dispatch was asking for all units in the area to respond. But that was not Dan's problem today. He turned it down quickly, but not quickly enough. At the end of 5 days in the backcountry, he was still far enough away from highways and accidents that he wasn't expected to answer the radio. As a ranger in the immigrant wilderness for the past 4 years, Dan Courtwright had learned when to listen to his radio and when to turn it off. But the bear paused, trying to place the sound. He looked around and suddenly spotted Dan frozen in place. The two of them watched each other for what seemed like a minute to Dan, but was probably more like 10 seconds. Sunlight from behind the bear made his fur seem to glow as if he were wreathed in dandelion fluff, outlining his lean and powerful body and limbs. Moving first one paw, then another, the bear grudgingly wandered off behind the trees. Once he turned his head away from Dan, the bear didn't bother to look back. A tall, thin ranger with a trim beard clearly wasn't a threat.
It's so vividly detailed. I'm wondering if it comes from your imagination or your personal experience.
A little of both. I have seen bears more or less in that scenario. I've certainly seen the sunlight behind them. That vision is quite amazing. And what is really amazing is watching an animal that big disappear into the woods, as this one does in a few seconds, a few paragraphs, and absolutely disappear. No sound, no vision, they're just gone. And you wonder where they went and how they got there that quickly.
And if you meet them again.
Yeah. Yep.
We're getting questions in the chat, but I'm wondering if you want me to ask you some of mine first and then go to the chat. Let's see.
However you want to do it.
I'm going to read the question and see if it fits at this moment or if I want to hang on to it for a moment. Actually, it's a question that's coming up. So let's stick with our list a moment. And
Okay.
Mike, I promise to get to that question. Tell us a little bit about your transition from wine writer to mystery writer that isn't set in the wine industry. It seems that might have been an obvious choice just to set it right here in our valley, but you chose instead to reach back to a different part of your life.
Yeah, and I think some of that just has to do with the fact that when you work with wine every day, it seemed a little too close to me. And for me, writing this book was a little bit of an escape, just as much as I hope reading it is an escape. Mm-hmm. So there I was stuck in the wine business. And when I wanted to do something creative, I wanted to wander off quite literally in a different direction. And so they always say to write about things you know and write about things you love. And that is true of the mountains. I know the mountains and I love them. And that's how it all got started.
Tell us a little bit more about that history, your connection to the mountains.
Well, it's a very funny story. Quite a few years ago, before my mom passed away, at one point, I had come home from a trip into the mountains. And I was over at her house and I was telling her about this wonderful hike we'd done in Tahoe, Eagle Falls up to Velma Lake and everything, and how beautiful it was. And she looked at me with this funny look on her face and she said, "Well, do you remember the first time you did that hike?" And I said, "No, I actually thought this was the first time I did this hike." She said, "No." She said, "You would have been about 11 months old." And I did that with your sister and your brother, and you did that hike on my hip. I'm not surprised you don't remember. You were a little baby, but this was also the day when this was before the day of Snugglies and kid backpacks. So she was literally lugging me under one arm for miles in the mountains. And yeah, so I grew up. My dad was a school teacher, but in the summers he spent his time being a ranger in the state parks up in the Sierra. So I think he enjoyed it. But I know for us kids, we just thought it was heaven.
And you returned to it when you thought of writing a novel. Well,
in fact, I can't remember a summer when I was a kid living in my parents' house that we didn't go on at least one camping trip in the mountains, literally every year. And then when I went to college, I would go backpacking with my friends. And when my wife and I got married, our first really serious weekend away was a camping trip up in Kings Canyon at 8,000 feet over Memorial Day. Cold enough, Mike Dunn, that in order to chill down the Rosé d'Anjou that I had brought to eat with our Kentucky Fried Chicken, that we were able to just stick it in a local snowbank and chill the rosé down and then drink it around the fire with the chicken. So yeah, I've been going to the mountains my whole life, and that's now almost 70 years.
So for those of us who, I read the book, for those on the call who have not read it yet, places in the setting, where are we in the mountains?
So the Immigrant Wilderness is just up north of Yosemite. And in fact, the picture behind me is almost exactly on the border between Yosemite and the Immigrant Wilderness. The name of the lake is called Boundary Lake because it's on the boundary of Yosemite National Park with the Immigrant Wilderness. Lots of granite, scraped very clean by the glaciers over time. And then of course the group is camped up there at an imaginary lake that has a huge wall of granite behind it, based maybe a little bit on something like Gem Lake or Immigrant Lake in the Immigrant Wilderness. And then part of the story revolves around climbing up this massive wall and the adventures that happen on the wall.
Tell us a little bit more. Well, let's dig into the main character. And tell us if there was anything that you based him on, maybe your father or maybe another detective type character. What are you bringing in your briefcase to the development of Dan?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at Dan and you read, and I have written now, I guess I should address this issue. I've written 4 of these books and I'm working on a 5th one. So there will be. You don't have
to wait too long for the next one.
There will be more in the series. And I've always been a little uncomfortable with the dynamic hero of a detective story who races into danger in every possible scenario. Everything he does violates every standard operating procedure of law enforcement, and then somehow single-handedly solves the problem. And so Dan is someone who, frankly, finds things happening to him as much as he forces the action. Mm-hmm. And I very much like that about him. He's a competent person, but he is not a dynamic, rule-breaking renegade the way so many of these guys are. And then he has a friend who is the local sheriff, Cal Healy. And one of the reasons I kept writing these books is I ended up liking Dan and Cal so much that I just wanted to spend time with them. So time to write another book. Yeah.
All set in the same locale in the Sonora.
All set as part of Dan's role as a ranger up there in the Immigrant Wilderness. Yeah. Yep.
Before we turn back to the wilderness, tell us about your favorite mystery writers and who you grew up chewing on.
Oh boy. Well, I remember, and again, I'm going to tell a story about my mom. She tells a story at one point when I was in elementary school, and I was apparently checking out from the local library all sorts of cheap detective novels. And at one point, the librarian called up my mother and basically said, "Aren't you worried that all of this trash is corrupting the mind of this young man?" And my mother, God bless her, knew the other things I've been reading at home and said, "Well, I think he's read enough good literature at home that he knows the difference." But I don't remember the books. I don't remember the books that we were talking about in that story. I do remember, as I've gotten older, 2 writers that I really enjoy and really like reading. And I hope that in some way I'm at least trying to emulate them a little bit. One of them is Tony Hillerman, who writes fabulous mysteries about the Southwest. And in some ways, the mystery almost becomes secondary to Hillerman's evocation of the Southwest and life there and culture there. And I love that about those books. And the other one is Donna Leon, who does the same thing in Venice. Mm-hmm. And in both cases, it's almost as if the mystery is just an excuse to go out into the Southwest or to wander down the little alleys and hop in a gondola and wander around Venice. And in some ways, that's some of what I was hoping to do with this book, which is, yes, the mystery is interesting, but it's also just an excuse to get out in the mountains, enjoy them.
Mike, do you want to ask your question, or would you like me to ask it for you? The one about the pandemic.
What, the one about the pandemic?
Yeah, the time.
Yeah, I was wondering, would you have launched this series without given the opportunity by virtue of the pandemic and having the time to knuckle down to the keyboard and undertake it?
Well, I actually wrote this book. I wrote about 4 or 5 years ago. And so subsequent books, I write 1 or 2 a year now. But it's not the writing of the book that the pandemic made possible, but the time to sort of pull the escape cord and say, what do you want to do with all your free time? And that's when I said, what I did was I started calling publishers and writing publishers and saying, hey, I got a book. I think that's good enough. It might get published. And heard back from a lot of people who said, basically, we're not publishing books anymore, which is, I'm sure, something you might, as a writer, have run into as well. But eventually found someone who said, you know, this could be fun. Let's do this. And that's yeah, we're now looking at getting the next one up and the one after that, hopefully. So yeah.
Before you, I'm curious about maybe a quick synopsis of those 2 books, but dig a little deeper in the Dan Cal relationship. Is that based on anybody you know, or where did that come from? And why was that the primary relationship and not the one with the love interest, or will she come up again in the future?
All of those characters, Kristen, Cal, and Dan, appear in all the books. But again, I wanted to avoid the idea of dynamic man solves mystery, wins girl, right off into the sunset sort of books, because those are just really boring to me. And so in some ways, a lot of this, and there's even a little bit of a play on his name, because of course, courtright means that he should know how to court a woman, and yet he's actually not very good at it. He's a little shy and he's a little awkward. And so through the course of these 4 books, you follow this relationship with Kristen. And at the same time, the initial relationship with Cal Healy, when I started writing the book was really about the rich family and their 7 kids, and how Dan was going to winnow through all this evidence and figure out what was going on. But once Cal appeared on the scene, you know, Rangers don't actually do much detective work. Serious crimes in the national forests are handled either by the FBI, if it's big enough, or a local sheriff. So you can't have him just solve everything. So I needed a sheriff. And once the sheriff arrived and they started talking, I just couldn't, yeah, they seem to be such good people. They seem to be having such fun working together, even in some really uncomfortable situations, that I just sort of followed them along and saw what would happen. Not really based on, I would say, any people I know, only based on, you know, one of the things I like about it is neither one of them is particularly in charge of the other. So there's none of the hierarchy you often see in a lot of these novels where, you know, the boss is overwhelming or the boss is incompetent. They don't have bosses. They kind of work together as a team and work things out, primarily because they really kind of like each other.
Which is the basis of an interesting relationship when they start with that.
Yep.
Jim is asking if this is going to be an ebook, but of course we have plenty of copies at the Bookmine and at Bookmine. So I'm going to put our link to ordering the book from us, and that'll be in the chat in a moment. When I have a second, I will get that to you. I'm trying. Let's see. Mike is saying, my apologies for not yet getting the book, but a lot of modern detectives have a darkness to them, flaws, anxieties, unscrupulous methods.
Yep.
Does Dan have any of that going on?
No, in fact, I mean, it's funny because my wife and I love to watch detective shows on television, but she has a rule that there can be no car crashes, no explosions, and no gunfights. So once you get to eliminate all of those shows, there's damn little left. And what I wanted to write here, Karen, you and I were talking before we started this. To me, writing this book was a little bit like a vacation. It allowed me to go up into those mountains and have a wonderful time.
Yeah.
And I ultimately wanted people to finish the book feeling the same way, that it had been a vacation. And I just got a note from a dear friend of mine back east who said, I just finished your book. It was the perfect summer vacation. I didn't get out of town this year. Your book was my summer vacation. And I thought, that's a wonderful thing. That's exactly what I'm hoping to do with these books. Not a whole lot of violence, not a whole lot of sex, blood, and rock and roll, just decent people trying to figure out what the heck's going on and some crazy things going on.
Well, speaking of summer vacations, any other place outside of California that you'd like to explore?
Well, we love to go hiking, and we've hiked everywhere from Patagonia and taken some backpacking trips in the Andes. This summer, we did a wonderful trip back to Yellowstone and the Tetons, and even got down to Rocky Mountain National Park for a couple of days, and quite astonished by Dinosaur National Monument, which I thought might be a single museum in the middle of the desert, but turned out to have all sorts of fabulous things. So we will go hiking whenever and wherever we can. And we have loved everywhere we've gone hiking. The Sierra is still the best place in the world to go hiking. It has the best weather. I mean, other than fires, it has the best weather. It is beautiful. It is accessible. It's astonishingly safe. And, even though we did a big trip to Yellowstone and back and all the rest, I still have done, I guess, 4 or 5 backpacking trips this year into the Sierra.
And Martha says it allowed her to go into the mountains too. So beautifully detailed. She felt like she was there. And I felt the same way. And I actually was reading it when the fires were burning through Tahoe. So it was a little bit of a fantasy escape also, and hoping that all the beautiful places will still be accessible.
Yeah, we took a trip last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, there was a big Donnell fire that was just north of the Immigrant Wilderness and burned up a canyon that was the first backpacking trip my wife and I had taken in a number of years. And we were just horrified that it had destroyed this wonderful place that was important to us. But we discovered by a little research and by exploring that if you walk up that canyon about a mile and turn left, there's a trail that goes up over the ridge and takes you into another valley that was untouched by the fire. So I think that's going to be the story of what happens in the mountains pretty much from here on out, is you're going to have to pick and choose and try to find the places that haven't burned, sadly enough.
But even in our own hikes around town, it's surprising how beautiful skyline is. When you get up into that burn area, and it's now a couple years past that fire, it's gorgeous. It gives you an entirely different experience.
Yeah, Mother Nature does come back in a hurry. Yeah.
So you've written a number of books, professional books on wine. I think you've already talked a little bit about why the shift just into something that you love. But tell us a little bit about your professional experience writing about wine.
Well, I ran a public relations and marketing firm for about 25 years in the wine industry. And before that, I worked in a couple of wineries and did work for another agency. So I was often called up by a winemaker and told I had to tell the story of his wine, or I was called by his boss to say, you've got to explain who makes this wine and why he makes it and all the rest. I've actually written part of a mystery novel that does take place in the wine industry, but I kept running into doors that I knew what was behind them, and that wasn't fun to me anymore. So I decided, nah, I'm gonna go up into the mountains where there are no doors, and something around the corner is always beautiful and wonderful, and there's always a surprise, whether it's, you know, a fungus on the ground or whether it's a blue jay screaming at you. There's always something that's new and different and fun. So that's why I headed up to the mountains.
And Mike is asking if you had an agent, or do you just approach all the publishers on your own?
I approached a number of people who were agents. I approached a number of people who were publishers. And the interesting thing about this one is Paul Chutko, who is with Valda Grace Books. It's really his company. We had worked together when I was doing public relations and marketing in the wine industry, because a friend of mine had written a book that Paul had published, and they'd actually asked me to do some promotional work on the book. So it suddenly occurred to me at one point, gee, I've got this book. Maybe Paul knows somebody who would be interested in publishing it. And after a few conversations, we sort of looked at each other and said, well, okay, let's just have Paul publish it. And so Valda Grace published it. Looks beautiful. And hopefully there are 3 or 4 more on the way.
Okay, well, you keep teasing us. Tell us a little bit about the next one. What's the adventure for our characters?
Let's see. The second book is called The Bones of the Earth. And it begins with a couple of elderly backpackers who walk into Dan's ranger station and inform him that they think they've found the bones, they think they found human remains in the backcountry. And he immediately thinks they probably found the rib cage of a deer. But then as they start exploring, it turns out they really did find the remains of a human. And then the question is, who is it? How long has that body been there? And so you get a little bit of the lore as some of the locals start saying, well, I remember there was this guy who went up into the mountain, you know, so you have all of that sort of element.
Oh, nice.
But then you also have Cal and Dan going up into the mountains together, visiting the site, figuring things out, and then tracing back, narrowing it down to, well, it must be this person, and then trying to recreate what happened almost 20 years after this person had disappeared.
20
so
years.
Number 2.
Okay. All right.
And then let's see, number 3 is called Holes in the Ground. And
I just have to ask, how, before I've got to interrupt you, but how long have these been just sitting around waiting to come into the?
Well, I wrote the first one, as I said, about 5 years ago.
5 years ago, right?
And it's sort of a cute story. Mike mentions Monty Wolf. The 4th book talks about Monty Wolf. Mike, good for you. 5 or 6 years ago, my daughter was living in Argentina, and she was complaining. She said, I'm not finding enough stuff to read in English, and it's kind of frustrating me. And I then sat down and said, okay, I'm her dad. I've been telling her stories her whole life. I'll tell her a story now. And so I sat down and I started writing a story for her. And at first I just thought, I'm just writing it for her. I'll send it off to her, end of story. But she loved it. And she said, oh, I want more of these. And then she sent it to her sister, who said, well, I want one of these. So I kind of wrote the second book for her sister.
Oh.
And then the third one is about the Pacific Crest Trail and how people can appear and disappear, because once you're on the Pacific Crest Trail, you adopt a trail name and you sort of become part of this, what they call the tramily, the group of people that travel the trail with you. And it's about someone who wants to disappear, but in fact may have disappeared more than he wanted to. And so Cal and Dan are trying to figure out what happened to him. That's called Holes in the Ground. And then the 4th one is actually the closest one in terms of being based on personal experience that I've had. And Mike, this gets down to Monty Wolf, because one of the rangers with whom I'm friends with up in the Sierra, he and I have a vision that we are eventually going to reopen the trails that go down into the Mokelumne Canyon. It's an enormous granite gorge. It's very rough. It's very tough to get there, but there used to be a series of trails. They have disappeared, and we are sometimes 20 yards at a time, sometimes a mile at a time, taking trips down there and doing trail work and trying to reopen these trails. And so the story is, what would happen if something really strange happened down there? There's nobody down there. It's really quite isolated. And so Dan and his buddy are going down working on the trail, and strange things happen down there. So,
well, let's open this conversation up. Jim is asking, how do you arrive at your character names? But I'd love for you guys to come off mute and just ask a question or join the conversation, have a comment about the book.
Well, Jim, you ask about the character names. I don't spend huge amounts of time talking about them or thinking about them. Dan Courtwright, actually, there is a reservoir up in the Sierra in the John Muir Wilderness called Courtwright Reservoir. And I thought it was sort of a nice name, and it sort of fit in with the character. So that Cal Healy just seemed like the right name for a sheriff up there. Some of them I spend a lot of time thinking about, and usually the more time I spend thinking about them, the less effective they are. So I even find myself halfway through the book saying, you know, that's a stupid name for that character. Let's go back and change that. And then, of course, Dan's assistant up at the ranger station is Doris. And Doris is in all the books, but you never learn Doris's last name.
Just Doris.
It's just Doris. And Doris is a wonderful older woman. She reports to Dan, but Dan realizes that she has a sort of institutional memory and knowledge that he can never approach. And so he consistently tells her to tell him what to do and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Unless you think it would spoil anything, tell us a little bit more about how you develop the characters of the family. You mentioned earlier that they're based on the 7.
The 7, yeah. I don't want to tell the 7
Okay.
what, but there are 7
we have to
things
figure that out
on.
ourselves.
Right. You can look up your medieval religious philosophy and see what there were 7 of, and you will identify the characters of the families. You'll even discover that the first letters of their name generally match up with the first letters of the names of the 7 elements of this religious philosophy. So, yeah.
Okay.
Clever. So I have a question.
Martha.
Yes, I have a sort of a plotting question for you. I wonder if, you know, while you're thinking about your next book, do you first think of the murder, or do you think of the characters and then think who might die and who might have done it and how?
So it's sort of interesting. The way I write these books is I generally start with a plot, and I will start with maybe 2 to 3 lines for each chapter, but I follow what's going to happen in the book. So I start with, okay, we'll start here, and then this will happen, and wouldn't it be cool if that happened? And then, oh, here's where he finds out. I don't actually know a lot of the time how they're going to end. And in fact, sometimes the other part of this is, so I write out the whole book, and the one I'm writing right now, I've written 24 chapters. It's 50 chapters long. So I have a paragraph for each chapter of the next 25 chapters. But I'm also going to tell you that at some point in that process, I'm going to get to chapter 36 or 32 or something and say, that doesn't happen. You know, it's going to happen this way. And then everything sort of changes a little bit. So I sort of introduce the characters. I kind of know where the plot is going, but then the more the characters interact, the more I think, oh, you know, that son of a bitch, that guy probably wouldn't do that. You know what he'd do? And then you got to change it to fit what he really would have done, because he's that kind of a guy. So yeah, it's a what my brother would call an iterative process.
Did you travel back to this location while you were writing the book? Did you think, I need to get in there and double check the lay of the land, or?
No, because first of all, it is not a specific place. It's an invented place. There is no such climbing tower in the immigrant wilderness called the Monument. But at the same time, I have taken, Google keeps sending me notices about the fact that I have way too many photos on Google Photos. I have taken endless photographs on our trip. So anytime I'm feeling like I need a little inspiration, and by the way, the cover for the book is in fact a photograph that I took. And in fact, it's the very lake you see behind me. It's Boundary Lake. It's just a different part of Boundary Lake. But yeah, I spend enough time in the mountains, and I can always go back there via the photographs that I don't. Yeah, although I will say that now when I'm hiking in the mountains, occasionally something happens and I think, oh, that's going to be in a book sooner or later. That's too good to just leave there on the ground. We've got to pick that one up and put it somewhere.
Have a little notepad in your back pocket.
No, in fact, the book I'm reading right now, Dan keeps taking mental notes, and at one point he says, I've got too many mental notes. I'm onto a second page in my mental notes, and that's not a good thing. I know I'm forgetting something, so then he has to go back and figure out what he's forgetting.
What else? Anyone else have a comment or a thought? Or I could read some reviews.
I'm interested in your writing process, Paul, whether you kind of do a bit at a time, kind of in a very consistent way, or if you have times of inspiration where you just spend 3 days writing a couple of chapters. How does it work for you?
I was inspired a little bit, and this is speaking of exactly the kind of heroes that I detest. I was inspired a little bit by Ian Fleming, who turns out he retired from his job and he went to the West Indies, and for 6 months of the year he would sit down and write the next James Bond movie or book, and then he would go back and live half the year in London having fun. And that struck me as I looked at retirement. I thought, boy, that's a pretty good plan. I'm hiking in the summertime. In the winter, I get to think about the mountains. But what I generally do is write at most a chapter a day. But when I'm feeling comfortable, and I have it's not a tight regimen, but I would say, right now in the last week, I've probably written 5 chapters in that book, and I'll sort of keep that up. The goal is to finish it in time to give it to the girls for Christmas. So, I better get working here. And so not an intense, focused schedule, but it takes me, one of the things I learned, we bought a cabin up in the mountains, in fact, very close to the immigrant wilderness. And one of the things I learned about working on that cabin is I had worked on our house many times at home. And when you're working on a tight schedule, you have a tendency to just try to get everything done as quickly as possible because you've got to be back at work on Monday. And so you've got to get the roof on by Sunday night and all of that kind of stuff. When you have a cabin, you have to break the work down into tiny little segments. You're only going to be there a couple of days. You get that much done. But then you go home and you have another week to think about what's going to happen next. And so that's kind of the way I approach this writing is I write a chapter, but I don't want to just keep going. I want to finish the chapter, sit it there. And I will tell you that at least 50% of the chapters, when I pick up the book the next day to write the following chapter, I go back in and change all sorts of stuff. And, that this guy should have said that. And, we need to mention this because this is going to come up later, and feed all that back into the chapter, then write the next chapter and then leave it alone and go think about it for 24 hours and then come back and pick it up again. So yeah, no college student all-nighters trying to cram all the writing into a 24-hour period or anything. Space it out, give myself time to think.
And also not approaching it like a job where you wake up every day and that that you're working it into a retirement is bliss. That's
Yep.
really wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yep. Yep.
What else? Who else has a comment or a thought or a backpacking tip, a place we should check out between now and this next snowfall?
Yeah, well, yeah, we've already got snow up there. Russ could probably give you some backpacking tips and some fishing advice as well. So, yeah.
Want to come on, Russ, and unmute? Or
Well, McCalmy Wilderness, Summit City Creek.
Yep.
It's a city at the bottom.
say it again, the name, the creek?
Summit City.
Okay. And why?
There's actually a plaque right at the bottom as you drop down from 4th of July Lake and head left up the creek. And there's a huge pile of cow bones there. Some cows didn't make it through the winter.
Yeah.
Beginning of another mystery.
Well, in fact, what Russ is talking about is that it was pretty much it was a gold rush town. It really only lasted one season, maybe 2 seasons. Oversold, lots of people came in, and within a year and a half, they discovered there really wasn't any gold there. The interesting thing, Russ, is that the plaque is in the wrong place. The actual site of Summit City is about a mile up canyon from there. So,
well, there's Plaza's Resort, which goes up Horsetail or Horseshoe Creek. Yeah, and there's bolts in the trees that drag the wagons up. So I've done that too. Some mystery. It's an interesting place.
Yeah, yeah. That is all part of that McCalmy Gorge where book number 4
Takes
occurs.
place.
Yeah.
Mike is asking what you've learned about marketing the book and what would you do differently, or do you have a new approach for the next one? Or maybe Paul wants to chime in on this as well.
Yeah, Paul should chime in on this because I originally said to Paul, I know how to do marketing. I've taught marketing for 27 years and I've done marketing for all sorts of people. But one of my concerns is I'm retired and I really don't want to work that hard. And so we've been, I have done some marketing, but I have not hired anybody else to do it. And the book would probably sell better if I did more of it. But it's hard work and I know how hard it is. So I'm taking it, if it's an elephant, I'm eating it in very small bites.
Amen to retirement.
I don't know if you have 5 books in the hopper. I don't know if you can retire. You're going to have to hire a publicist to make this happen. Yeah, it's tough, huh? What else? Who has another? Here, I'm going to read us some of the reviews. I have them up here. So.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Let's see. This is Rick Kussman, best-selling New York Times author and co-host of Bottle Talk from Cap Radio in Sacramento. Danger of Falling Rocks gives us a vibrant feel of the High Sierra, a charming new mystery hero, and engaging fast-moving mystery written with energy and a nice touch of wit. Paul Wagner's love of the outdoors and his experience hiking and camping takes readers right into the mountains. The zippy writing keeps the story moving along the Sierra trails through the lineup of interesting, quirky characters and down the winding mystery path until the satisfying end. It's a great summer read, whether or not you can find your way into the wilderness.
Yeah, what I love about that is his comment about the zippy writing, because one of the things I like about reading a fun mystery is that you get to the end of the chapter, and to me, there's a Charles Dickens element to this because he wrote so many of his books as supplements to newspapers, where his job was to get people to buy the next issue of the newspaper to find out what happens to little Nell or whatever it is. And so I had a little bit of that sense as I was writing that I want people to get to the end of the chapter, particularly if they're reading at bedtime. I want them to get to the end of the chapter and say, damn, I should probably go to sleep, but I'll just read one more chapter. And my hope is they would just keep doing that.
And I don't know what about reading that last review just brought a scene to mind that was memorable for me, because I could see it vividly, but I'd never heard of anything like this happening, where you were leading the family out of the wilderness and using the horses as shields.
Yeah.
Tell me where that invention came from. I imagine it's not an invention, but it was surprising to me.
Yeah. And a good example of Dan not being the foolhardy hero who races up the mountain, throws a rock at the gunman who's got an AR-15 and solves the entire problem, but rather says, how the hell are we going to get out of this? And realizes that, in the Old West, it was standard practice to duck down behind your covered wagons and behind your horses to protect yourself when the fire got hot. And so it just sort of seemed natural to me that sitting in that scenario with a bunch of people who aren't very competent, because the children of this family are not, and they're grown-ups, they're no children here, but the siblings in the family most of them would have a tough time hiking a few miles anywhere. So how do you get them out of this complicated situation? And yeah, it just seemed like it made sense to me to have them duck behind the horses.
Yeah, I could see the whole thing happening from a vista. I felt like I was on the other side of the mountain watching this happen. Jim is asking, do you have a proofreader who is a friend or a family member, or do you rely on the publisher for this task? Or Grammarly? No, I'm kidding. Probably all
actually,
of the above.
Great question, Jim, because my wife is a professional proofreader. She has proofread, I can't count the number of books she's proofread, everything from my own marketing books to books on wine chemistry to all sorts of different things. She's currently proofreading a couple of novels by some writers in Hawaii. And so, first of all, I've been writing long enough that most of the obvious, I'm pleased to say that when my wife goes through and proofreads the book, it doesn't come back covered in red ink. Now part of that is she just fixes stuff. So, if there's and of course we can all thank Word for having spell check anyway, but she generally, I think at the end of a single book, will come to me with maybe 6 or 8 different locations where she says, it's not exactly clear what you're saying here, or did you mean him or did you mean her when you said this? But she is a professional proofreader, so she does all of that. And we haven't heard from Paul Chutko yet, but I think he would agree that she does a pretty decent job of getting it in pretty good shape. A real blessing. But it also means, as a writer, I don't want to disappoint her, so I try to be pretty careful about making sure things are pretty good to begin with. I don't want her, she's my wife, I don't want her to think I'm an idiot. So
not for that reason anyway.
That's right. I give her enough other reasons to think I'm an idiot. She doesn't need the book to add to the equation.
Well, we just have a few more minutes together. Who has another question? Or I could go back and let's see, hang on a minute. I will give you what Sasha Paulson from the Napa Register said. Clever and captivating, Wagner pulls readers along on a trail through the mountains, keenly observing a world in which the greatest threat, of course, is humans. An excellent excursion for armchair mountaineers. And you said she had another comment in her review that
when she interviewed me after she'd read the book, she called me up and she says, okay, I want to interview you for the article. And when she wrote the article, she had an absolutely wonderful first line. She said, after a successful career in the wine industry, Paul Wagner has taken up murder. And I just thought that was an absolutely wonderful way to get, if I'd written that line, it'd be right at the beginning of the book, because that's a way to get people to read more.
You have the right tools on your trail crew.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Can I jump in here, Karen?
I would love for you to. Hi, Paul.
Hi, guys. First of all, Paul came to me and said, I've written these books. And I said, sounds great. Why did you write them? He said, I wrote them for my kids. And to me, that was a sale right there.
Mhm.
Writing is a tough job. And if you can bring a sense of commitment and joy and purpose to the task the way Paul has, it just makes the entire experience much more rewarding for everybody. It's a tough business, selling books. We could talk about marketing. I certainly want to salute Napa Bookmine for doing this and
Yes,
doing
hear,
so
hear.
much else to support writers and support my company here in the Napa Valley. You know, this is a world that's run now by Amazon. 3/4 of all books are sold by Amazon. It's terribly, terribly painful for local bookstores. It's terribly painful for smaller publishers. But I feel very blessed to work with people like Paul, who bring not only a sense of purpose, but a sense of joy and professionalism. Paul mentioned his wife. She did a fabulous job with proofreading. I have a whole team of proofreaders that I would have turned to, but there was no need to. So it's been great. And I tell you, the book itself is such an easy read. I mean, I think there's an old saying, easy reading is hard writing, but it really feels like Paul made a breakthrough at some stage in all this, where he really found a voice. He found an ability to express himself, express characters, draw characters, evoke scenery and image and feeling and drama, of course. And that's quite rare. And I salute him, and I think he's going to be enjoying a lot of positive response from his other books as well.
Cool. Thanks, Paul.
Yes, and it really is through events like this where the book takes off. You know, we read it, we come together, hear from the author, and then share it with our friends and family. I know you want another one written by Christmas, and this was supposed to be a good summer read, but it would work wonderful as a holiday gift as well. And yeah, it's supporting the Bookmine and any independent, locally owned bookstore is the way we keep them alive.
Yeah.
And actually, not to go on and on about this, but COVID has been really good to the Napa Bookmine. We've been able to deliver books locally. Naomi does it in her car, she drives around the neighborhood delivering books. And yeah, so we love hosting you and having giving a forum to our local authors. We have so many, it's really fabulous. And Paul, I'm kind of curious if you wanted to pitch something that's coming up next that we should watch for from your publishing company, and then we'll get some final words from the other Paul.
Well, thank you for that. And I would just say, you know, we forget that books are a cornerstone of our culture and our history.
Yes.
And we don't treat the literary effort and quality books with the respect that they deserve. I think, you know, when I look at ebooks and things like that, they have their purpose and everything else, but there's nothing like holding a book in your hands and getting the feel of the paper and the feeling of the cover. And, you know, Paul's cover is so evocative of what the story is. I'm sitting up here on Green Valley Road, and I happen to have an entire small library, floor-to-ceiling books. A lot of it came from my parents. My mother was an avid collector, and she instilled in me this tremendous love of very high-quality books and books that you want to hold on to and cherish. And my sons are going to certainly have their choice one of these days. And Napa Bookmine gets this. And you really understand. Naomi and Elena and Karen, this is part of our heritage. And having a session like this we get to talk directly to the author. It's so rewarding. And I salute Book Passage in Marin that does the same thing. But I would say that for people who are in the wine industry or like to read about wine, we've done a book called Lineage, Life, Love, and 6 Generations in California Wine by Stephen Mirasu, who is down in Livermore. And his family has literally been one of the trailblazers way back when in California wine. And Stephen writes beautifully and passionately about what it feels like to be in a vineyard, what it feels like to have your arms absolutely up to the shoulders in freshly cut grapes. I recommend Lineage. I know you guys have it at Napa Bookmine.
Mhm.
And I just would say, whatever feedback readers give us, either to Napa Bookmine or on Amazon or Val de Grace Books, it's very important for us because it's all about connecting. Paul realized that the first job is to entice the reader into the story, make them want to not put that book down. And reader feedback is extremely important, as are these sessions. And Karen and I, again, thank you for this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a
Yes.
pleasure.
Stephen Mears is a friend, and he is a winemaker, but I have done some presentations with him over the years. And one of the things I love about Stephen Mears is he used to teach American literature at NYU, and he would much rather talk to you about Faulkner than he would like to talk to you about Chardonnay or Cabernet, which makes talking to him about wine really fun and interesting because he does have a very different way of talking about it, and his book captures a lot of that. So yeah, I loved it. Yeah. And Karen, I also want to point out that my wife is a member of the Borgia Book Club, which buys all of its books through the Napa Bookmine. So she is constantly in your store picking up books. And again, that to me is part of what makes a community, is having folks who not only see each other in the grocery store, but
Yeah.
read the same books at the same bookstore. And it's part of being a town, part of being a community.
Well, I've been virtual for a number of different reasons up until, well, at the end of this month, I start training in the bookstore, and I look forward to seeing all of you there and meeting your wife and having you come in and sign some more copies. And
Happy to do it.
yes, it was lovely being with everyone tonight. A pleasure to read this book. And I can't wait to see all of you in Napa Bookmine coming up in the few weeks. And please spread the word about Paul's book. And we all look forward to the next one. Thank you. And watch for your emails. We'll send out the link to this feed that you can then send on to your friends and family. Hopefully they'll enjoy the conversation as well.
And Martha, I saw your question, and I will talk to Paul about that.
Sorry. There we go.
Good.
Good night, everyone.
Hey, thanks for joining us. Good to
It
see
was
you all.
wonderful. Good night.